12 miles off the Yorkshire coast, in the waters east of Hull, lies the wreck of the SS Longbenton. Built in 1898, she was a steam collier measuring 64.3 metres in length. On the 12th of August 1914, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War, she was requisitioned by the Admiralty. She initially served as an expeditionary force transport before being redeployed as a collier in October 1915, transporting coal for the war effort. On the 27th of June 1917, while sailing from the River Tyne to Devonport with 1,200 tons of coal, Longbenton was struck by a torpedo fired by the German submarine UC-63. The torpedo hit No. 2 hold, and the ship sank by the bow in just 2 minutes, remarkably with no loss of life. Longbenton's original design plans have not survived, and no confirmed photographs of portraits of her are known. Before we get into the dive, let's compare her with similar vessels from the period to understand what she may have looked like. I found 5 ships built during the 1890s with broadly similar dimensions and gross tonnage. SS Clytie and Eastham were also steam colliers from the same decade. SS Ashington was built for the Ashington Coal Company, while SS Rose was a similarly sized cargo steamer. All 4 were within approximately 100 gross tons of Longbenton. SS Wharf is a particularly useful comparison. At 914 gross registered tons, she was only 10 tons lighter than the Longbenton, although Wharf was slightly longer, but multiple photos of her exist. Looking at these contemporary ships, we can estimate that Longbenton would have looked something like this: a typical, late Victorian steam collier, with a central funnel and masts positioned fore and aft. From the design of these comparable ships, we would expect to find a Scotch marine boiler, possibly accompanied by a smaller auxiliary donkey boiler, 2 or perhaps 3 cargo holds, and a triple expansion steam engine. So let's look at the dive and see which parts of that predicted arrangement we can actually find. Here is a sonar image of the wreck, which we will annotate as we progress through the dive. The first thing to note is that the wreck measures approximately 66 metres on the sonar, compared with the Longbenton's registered length of 64.3 metres. The close agreement suggests that she initially settled on the seabed largely intact, and that the wreck has not become widely dispersed. Dropping onto the southernmost end, we are expecting to find either the bow or the stern. We quickly come across rudder and propeller, confirming that we have landed on the aft section of the wreck. The stern lies on its port side and stands approximately 4 metres proud of the seabed. The rudder and single-screw propeller are both clearly visible. We can also identify some deck machinery, together with the aft starboard mooring bollards. Here is the ladder that would have provided access between the stern deck and the compartment below, leading towards the steering gear and tiller flat. Moving forwards, we reach the remains of the main engine, an area now filled with fish. Thanks to Rick's footage, we can identify the connecting rods and crankshaft. Their arrangement is consistent with a reciprocating triple expansion steam engine. Although the upper cylinders and piston assembly have collapsed, the crankshaft remains visible on the left. This would have transmitted power through the thrust and propeller shafts, which passed through the stern gland to turn the propeller. The machinery layout provides further evidence that we are looking at the correct wreck, or at least a very similar steam collier from that period. We now reach the source of this prominent sonar shadow, Longbenton's large Scotch marine boiler. Massive and still remarkably intact, the boiler allows us to identify many aspects of its construction. Here for comparison is a triple furnace Scotch marine boiler from the time. At the bottom of the boiler face are 3 large furnace openings, although only one now stands completely above the seabed. These are where the stokers would have shovelled coal into the furnaces. Each furnace opening was divided by the fire grate. Coal burned on top of this grate, while ash and clinker collected in the space beneath it. The hot combustion gases travelled along the furnaces towards the rear of the boiler before returning back through hundreds of smaller fire tubes. These tubes were surrounded by water, transferring their heat through a large surface area and converting the water into steam. The many small holes visible across the boiler face are the ends of those fire tubes. They would have originally opened into a smoke box attached to the front of the boiler, which then connected directly to the funnel and vented the combustion gases above the ship. The upper section of the boiler contained the steam space, and there would have been air fluid level here, as the water, heated by those hundreds of fire tubes, evaporated into steam in the upper section. The circular features visible across the boiler face are the ends of the internal stay rods, which run between the front and rear plates. These prevented the large flat surfaces from bulging or potentially failing under steam pressure. At the top of the boiler are the remains of several fittings and valves. These controlled the flow of steam and included safety equipment designed to prevent the pressure inside the boiler from rising too high. Directly in front of this is a small, intact cylindrical structure. This has valves on the top, a small indent with fire tubes in mid, and a larger opening in the bottom. This is consistent by comparing to original designs with a smaller donkey boiler, the furnace opening at the bottom for the fire tubes to transmit the heat to the water, and the top part to transfer the steam. These were common in ships of this period and were used to run the auxiliary machines when the main boiler was not in use. Contemporary small steam colliers, such as the Sunderland-built USS Ratcliffe, show large, simple cargo spaces occupying most of the hull forward of the machinery. This section of Longbenton is strikingly empty of machinery and substantial debris. Her cargo consisted of 1,200 tons of coal. Whilst coal does not dissolve in seawater, over more than a century it can break into smaller fragments and dust, become dispersed by currents and storms, or settle into the seabed and beneath the collapsed wreckage. We estimate that each cargo hold on a ship of this size would have been approximately 14 to 15 metres long by looking at comparable vessels. This relatively empty section measures about 27 metres on the sonar, fitting remarkably well with two adjoining holes. The contemporary report of Longbenton's sinking states that the torpedo struck her at number 2 hold. I found 3 other steam colliers from this period with 3 holes, but each were 10 to 15 metres longer than the Longbenton. Taken together, the ship's length, the 27-metre cargo section, the arrangement of comparable colliers, and the reference to the number 2 hold, the evidence strongly suggests the Longbenton had 2 cargo holds rather than 3. If that reconstruction is correct, this section immediately forward of the boiler represents number 2 hold, and therefore the area in which the torpedo struck in 1917. Continuing forward of the remains of the 2 cargo holds, we finally reach the northernmost end of the wreck. Here the hull narrows sharply into an unmistakable prow, confirming that we have reached Longbenton's bow. Although much of the surrounding structure has collapsed, the pointed profile remains sufficiently intact to identify its original form. Close to the bow, we see both of the anchors lodged in their hawse pipes, the reinforced opening through which the anchor chain passes into the ship. Its presence confirms the identification of this end as the bow. However, the anchor appears to point downwards into the wreckage rather than hanging naturally away from the hull. If the bow were upright, we would expect the anchor and hawse pipe to be positioned on the side of the prow, with the anchor hanging outward or lying on the seabed beside it. This inverted orientation of the anchor strongly suggests that the bow section is rolled over completely and is now lying upside down. That would explain why relatively little recognisable deck machinery is visible here. The forecastle deck, anchor windlass and mooring equipment may now be trapped underneath the overturned hull. This also fits the contemporary account of Longbenton sinking by the bow. After the torpedo struck a number 2 hold, the forward section rapidly flooded and plunged beneath the surface. The stresses generated during that near vertical descent or the impact of the seabed may have caused the bow to twist or overturn before finally coming to rest. Longbenton's story continued in the courts after her sinking. Her owners, Harris Brothers and Company of Swansea, were awarded £28,500 in compensation by the government because she had been sunk after being requisitioned for the war effort. But they argued that this undervalued the ship and sued the shipping controller for a larger payment. They claimed that compensation should reflect what Longbenton would have fetched on the open market during the wartime shipping boom. In Harris versus Shipping Controller in 1918, however, the court ruled against the owners, holding that her value had to be assessed as a vessel already under government requisition, rather than as a freely marketable merchant ship. The £28,500 award therefore stood, with judgment given for the shipping controller. The decision helped establish an important principle for the compensation claims that followed the war. Ship owners could not use inflated wartime prices to determine the values of vessels already under government control. With our time on this wreck nearly at an end, it was time for us to surface. Although Longbenton's plans and photographs have long been lost, the sonar and dive footage allows us to reconstruct much of her original layout, with 2 cargo holds forward of a Scotch Marine boiler and a donkey boiler, ahead of a reciprocating triple expansion steam engine and a single screw propeller. The stern now lies on its port side, while the orientation of the anchor suggests that the bow may have overturned completely. Taken together, the wreck's 66-metre extent, machinery sequence, 2-hold arrangement and surviving bow and stern fittings give us a remarkably complete picture of a ship for which no original plans or confirmed photographs survive. Thank you very much for watching.